I thought my mother toasting my birthday while sending my brother to raid my apartment was her cruelest act. I was wrong. They wanted files to erase me from the family cafe, swallow millions of dollars, and frame me before everything exploded. When my brother returned pale and announced to the table, "Her door is sealed with police tape," I understood. Tonight, my family was no longer a family, it was a war zone. My name is Brinley Perry. I am 34 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have made my living tearing apart carefully constructed lies. As a vendor risk investigator at Harbor Slate Compliance Group in St. Louis, my daily routine involves hunting down buried assets, tracking phantom shell companies, and exposing the microscopic fractures in pristine corporate facades. You learn very quickly in my line of work that the most dangerous traps are always the ones painted to look exactly like open doors. Tonight, however, the flawless, smiling facade did not belong to a corrupt chief executive officer. It belonged to my own mother. I pushed through the heavy wooden door of Juniper Glass Café, immediately struck by the thick, nostalgic scent of roasted espresso beans and burnt cinnamon. This place had been our family's anchor for decades, a worn but beloved cornerstone of the historic downtown district. But as I stepped into the brightly lit main dining area for my birthday dinner, the rustic charm felt distinctly hollow and utterly manufactured. My mother, Colleen Perry, was holding court in the center of the room. She was practically vibrating with an unnatural, manic energy that she desperately tried to pass off as maternal warmth. She had reserved the entire back section of the restaurant, stringing up sparkling fairy lights and arranging elaborate, towering floral centerpieces that felt far too expensive for our family's usual tight budget. I stood near the coat rack and slowly scanned the room. The guest list was my first blaring warning bell. This was absolutely not a cozy, intimate birthday gathering. Colleen had invited an entire theater troupe of potential collateral damage. Aunts and uncles I had not spoken to in 3 years sipped champagne near the bar. A handful of local real estate brokers in sharp, tailored suits were mingling near the brick fireplace, their presence entirely inexplicable for a family birthday. And sitting right at the head of the long oak table, looking like a well-fed vulture in a navy sport coat, was her brand-new fiancé, Deacon Vale. The atmosphere did not feel like a celebration. It felt like a meticulously arranged stage production, designed specifically to keep me seated and smiling while the heavy scenery was quietly shifted behind my back. We took our seats, the sharp clinking of silverware echoing over the low, tense hum of forced conversation. Colleen stood up, theatrically tapping her silver spoon against the rim of her crystal wine glass. The room fell into an obedient hush. She launched into a teary, heavily practiced speech about how endlessly proud she was of her brilliant, independent daughter. Everyone raised their glasses in unison, a chorus of polite congratulations ringing out. As the cold rim of my glass touched my lips, Colleen leaned down to my younger brother, Mason. She clearly thought the sudden noise of the cheering table would drown out her voice. She underestimated the acoustics of the old brick walls, or perhaps she just underestimated the trained ear of an investigator. I heard her voice, a sharp, hissing whisper that cut straight through the applause. "While everyone is here, go and change the keypad and get the blue tin before she leaves." I did not blink. I took a slow sip of my red wine. Mason swallowed hard, his prominent Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. He stood up abruptly, his thigh hitting the table and nearly knocking over his tall water glass. "I forgot the extra cake at the bakery down the street," he announced loudly to the table, his voice cracking slightly on the final word. "I will be right back." He did not dare look at me as he practically sprinted for the front door, the bell chiming frantically as he pushed his way out into the cool evening air. I kept my face entirely impassive, turning my attention back to my plate. The blue tin. She meant the locked metal box, hidden in the walls of my loft. I felt a cold, metallic calm wash over me. Colleen, desperately eager to fill the sudden vacuum left by Mason's panicked departure, immediately steered the conversation to a new topic. "You know, seeing everyone here together tonight just reminds me of what truly matters in this life. she declared, her eyes sweeping over the gathered guests, but deliberately avoiding any direct contact with mine. Absolute family trust. In this unpredictable, harsh world, we really only have each other. We must share everything, protect everything together. Secrets are the poison that destroy families. I offered her a polite, closed-mouth smile, nodding in apparent agreement. The hypocrisy was so incredibly thick it was physically suffocating. She was lecturing a room full of strangers about absolute trust, while her own son was currently speeding halfway across the city to break into my secure apartment. I spent the next 60 minutes eating roasted chicken, discussing local property taxes with a broker I did not know, and watching the clock on the wall tick away the seconds. Exactly 1 hour later, the heavy front door of the cafe chimed again. Mason walked in. His face was completely drained of blood, the exact color of a freshly bleached tablecloth. His hands were trembling so violently, he had to shove them deep into the pockets of his slacks. He stumbled awkwardly toward our long table, bypassing his empty chair completely, and went straight to stand behind Colleen. He leaned down, his mouth right next to her ear. The background music had coincidentally lulled, and a sudden, heavy quiet had fallen over our end of the dining room. His frantic, breathy whisper carried effortlessly across the white linen and polished silver. Her apartment is sealed. There are police officers in the hallway, and yellow warning tape stretched all over her door. The entire table went dead silent. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died in people's throats. Deacon Vale stiffened in his chair, his eyes darting toward the exit. I watched my mother's face with the detached precision of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. Any normal parent in the world would have gasped. They would have grabbed my hand, pulled out their phone, and frantically asked if I was safe, if I had been robbed, if anyone had been hurt. Colleen Perry did not look at me, not even a passing glance. Her eyes darted wildly toward Deacon, absolute panic bleeding rapidly through her heavy layer of foundation makeup. Her first question, hissed right back at Mason in a tone completely devoid of any maternal concern, was chilling enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Is the alcove behind the laundry intact? In that single, frozen, terrible second, the heavy fog of the past 34 years evaporated completely. Every bizarre, manipulative family dynamic snapped into sharp, brutal focus in my mind. The puzzle pieces I had been collecting my entire life suddenly formed a devastating picture. I remembered the endless years of subtle financial control, the times Colleen demanded my banking passwords and routing numbers under the guise of an emergency contingency plan, the late-night phone calls pushing me to quickly sign complex tax documents and loan modifications I was never allowed to read, the constant, guilt-tripping reminders dropped into casual conversations that everything of mine was actually the family's property. They were never protecting me. They were actively managing me. To them, I was not a beloved daughter or a cherished sister. I was merely a financial asset they were desperately trying to liquidate before I realized my own net worth. They sat there, holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. They fully expected a dramatic reaction. They expected tears, or a panicked, screaming phone call to the local precinct, or a hysterical demand for answers right there in the middle of the restaurant. That was exactly how Colleen operated her entire life. She thrived on emotional chaos, using the loud, messy noise to cover her quiet, illegal tracks. I did not scream. I did not throw my expensive glass of wine in her face. I did not ask a single question. I slowly, deliberately, folded my linen napkin and placed it gently on the table. I picked up my leather purse from the back of my chair, the metal clasp clicking loudly in the dead silence of the room. I reached into my wallet, pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills to cover my portion of the meal, and set them carefully next to my untouched slice of birthday cake. I looked directly at Colleen, locking eyes with her for the very first time all evening. I offered her a calm, chilling, knowing smile. Then, I turned on my heel and walked straight out of Juniper Glass Café. I did not look back, leaving them to drown in the suffocating, panicked silence they had meticulously created for themselves. It was my very first strike back at them, and they were too busy staring at the money on the table to even realize the war had officially begun. The drive from the downtown commercial district to my loft in the old riverfront warehouse district took exactly 14 minutes, but the journey felt like crossing a cold, invisible border into a different reality. The evening rain had started to fall, a thin, misting drizzle that turned the amber streetlights into blurry, bleeding halos against the slick black asphalt. I kept the car radio completely switched off. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the cabin of my sedan was a sharp, necessary contrast to the chaotic, manufactured warmth I had just walked away from. I gripped the leather steering wheel, realizing with a strange sense of detachment that I did not feel the icy, paralyzing grip of fear that usually accompanies the news of a home invasion. Instead, a cold, crystalline clarity settled over my brain, sharp and unforgiving. Mason's panicked, bloodless face at the dinner table remained burned into my vision. I knew with absolute certainty that my mother's people had not gone to my building to simply change a keypad lock. You do not send someone away from a crowded, highly publicized dinner table to perform routine maintenance. They had gone there to retrieve something specific. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser painted the exposed brick exterior of my renovated warehouse building in rhythmic, violent strokes. I parked half a block down the street, my heels clicking a steady, measured beat against the damp, uneven pavement as I approached. Bright yellow police tape was strung aggressively across the entrance of my unit on the 3rd floor, a jarring slash of color against the dark hallway. A uniformed officer and a plainclothes investigator, a heavy-set man with a graying mustache who introduced himself as Detective Miller, were standing just outside the splintered wooden doorframe. "Miss Perry?" the detective started, his voice a low, sympathetic rumble. "I need to prepare you before we step inside. It is quite a mess in there, but I have to tell you, the pattern of this break-in is highly unusual." I ducked gracefully under the yellow tape, my eyes immediately scanning the open-concept living space. The modern noir aesthetic of my loft, usually defined by clean architectural lines, polished concrete floors, and deep industrial shadows, was severely disrupted. Drawers were pulled open, couch cushions were tossed onto the rug, and a few stray papers were scattered near the entryway. But Detective Miller was entirely correct. It was completely the wrong kind of mess. My sleek silver laptop still sat perfectly centered on the large oak dining table, the charging cable neatly coiled beside it. My professional camera equipment, a setup worth easily $5,000, remained completely untouched inside its padded canvas bag right by the large window. Even the small, dark velvet box on my bedroom dresser, which contained a pair of heavy diamond stud earrings, was sitting exactly where I had left it that morning. Desperate burglars looking for quick, untraceable cash do not leave high-end electronics and diamonds behind. They bypass the high-value items entirely, Detective Miller noted, watching my face closely for a reaction. They went straight to the back of the unit. I followed his heavy footsteps down the narrow corridor, my breath perfectly steady, my heart beating at a remarkably normal resting rate. The small, functional laundry closet at the end of the hall was a certified disaster zone. The heavy, front-loading washing machine had been violently shoved aside, its metal feet gouging deep, permanent scratches into the expensive hardwood floor. But the real violence had been inflicted on the wall directly behind the white dryer unit. The thick drywall had been repeatedly smashed with something heavy, creating a jagged, gaping hole about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high. Fine, powdery white plaster dust coated the black appliances and the floor like a layer of morbid, toxic snow. I stood still, staring directly into the dark, empty cavity between the exposed wooden studs. For 4 long years, that precise, hidden alcove had housed a battered, rectangular blue tin. Inside that unassuming metal box were the only existing physical copies of my grandmother's original will, the certified land survey of the Café property, and a thick, heavy paper envelope sealed with red wax. I could still clearly hear my grandmother's frail, raspy voice echoing in my memory from the day she pressed that envelope into my hands from her hospital bed. "Keep this safe, Brinley," she had whispered, her grip surprisingly strong for a dying woman. And only open it when you no longer trust your family. I looked at the jagged edges of the broken drywall, and the corners of my mouth twitched upward into a ghost of a humorless smile. I felt absolutely zero panic as I stared at the empty space, because the hollow cavity was exactly how I had left it. 21 days ago, right after unearthing a deeply buried ownership appendix that my mother had conveniently failed to ever mention during the estate settlement process, I had quietly, systematically relocated the blue tin. Its explosive contents were currently sitting inside a heavily encrypted safety deposit box at a private commercial bank across the river, registered under a corporate shell name that Colleen did not even know existed. They had broken in, destroyed my property, and risked federal charges entirely for a ghost. I turned back to the detective, my professional instincts as a compliance investigator fully overriding any lingering shock of the intrusion. Detective Miller, I need the preliminary scene report as soon as it is filed. I also need the precise timestamps from the door sensor alarms, the access logs from the lobby, and any high-resolution photographs your crime scene team took of the shoe prints near the entryway. Miller raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by my cold, clinical demands. Most victims standing in their vandalized homes were crying, shaking, or asking who could have done such a thing. I was merely asking for data points. The alarm tripped at exactly 7:42 in the evening, he replied, flipping open his small, spiral-bound notebook. The sensor on the rear fire escape window was breached first. The internal motion detectors show they were inside the apartment for barely 6 minutes. Whoever did this moved with intense purpose. They bypassed the bedrooms and the main living area entirely. They knew exactly where they were going. 6 minutes. A random stranger looking for a hidden wall safe would have spent at least 45 minutes tapping on walls, tearing up floorboards, and tearing apart the closets. This specific intruder walked through my rear window, completely ignored the obvious valuables, marched straight into the laundry room, and smashed a specific patch of drywall with surgical, premeditated precision. They knew the layout of my home better than most of my close friends did. Deep in the pocket of my damp wool coat, my cell phone began to vibrate violently. It was a relentless, angry buzzing that demanded immediate attention. I pulled the device out. The glowing screen was illuminated with a rapid-fire sequence of unread text messages from Colleen. I read them in the harsh, white glare of the police investigator's flashlight. "Where are you?" followed immediately by, "Is anything missing from the apartment?" And then, the most damning, transparent message of all. "Did you see any weird boxes lying around?" There was not a single question asking if I was hurt. There was not a single inquiry about my physical safety, my emotional state, or whether the police had caught the perpetrator. Every single word she typed was a frantic, desperate probe entirely focused on the physical evidence. A moment later, a new message from Mason popped up, breaking through his mother's digital barrage. "Bryn, Mom is freaking out right now. She is way too stressed out with the wedding planning and everything else. Do not turn this little break-in into a massive crisis. Okay, just let the cops handle the paperwork and come back to the cafe. Please do not make this worse than it has to be." I scoffed softly, the sound dry and bitter in the dusty air. Mason was always the weak link in their operation. In his pathetic attempt to play the family peacemaker, his panicked tone, his desperate attempt to minimize a felony breaking and entering into a minor inconvenience, he was bleeding guilt all over my bright screen. He knew exactly what had happened because he was likely the one coordinating the timeline from the cafe parking lot while pretending to pick up a phantom bakery order. By telling me not to make a crisis out of it, he accidentally revealed he knew there was a crisis to be made. I stood completely alone in the center of my ruined apartment, the white plaster dust clinging stubbornly to the dark hem of my coat. I looked from the smashed, empty wall to the illuminated screen of my phone, reading the digital panic of my own flesh and blood. The facade of the happy family dinner was completely dead, buried under the rubble of this failed extraction attempt. This was no longer a domestic dispute over old inheritances or simple miscommunications. This was a calculated, aggressive, An highly illegal campaign to hunt down and destroy physical evidence before I could pull the trigger. They had drawn the battle lines right through the walls of my home, using a sledgehammer to deliver the message. I locked my phone screen, severing the digital connection to their panic, and slid the device back into my pocket. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cold, dusty air, feeling a dangerous, powerful calm settle deep into my bones. If my mother wanted a war over the hidden ashes of Juniper Glass Café, she had just handed me the match. 6 months ago, the air in my grandmother's house smelled thickly of dried lavender and stale grief. Ruth Ellery had been the only genuine spine our family possessed, and her funeral had been a parade of hollow condolences led by my mother. A week after we buried her, I volunteered to box up the study. Colleen had already swept through the house, taking the main estate files in neat categorized binders, confidently declaring that everything was perfectly in order and barely enough to cover the burial costs. I should have known then that neatness in our family was always a red flag. It was a loose floorboard under a heavy oak filing cabinet that betrayed my mother's curated narrative. When I moved the cabinet to roll up the rug, the board shifted, revealing a shallow depression wrapped in thick plastic. Inside was a simple manila envelope, completely separate from the official probate records Colleen had so graciously managed. It contained a faded topographical map of the property, a heavily notarized trust appendix, and a certified ledger of corporate shares that had miraculously never appeared in any of my mother's tearful financial updates. From the time I was old enough to wipe down tables, the family narrative was etched into my brain like a religious text. Juniper Glass Café was a sinking ship. We were told it was a struggling, outdated diner barely keeping its head above the rising tide of gentrification. The family wealth, whatever little had existed generations ago, had supposedly vanished during the hard economic recessions of the past 2 decades. My mother played the role of the tragic, self-sacrificing matriarch flawlessly, constantly sighing over ledgers, complaining about the crushing weight of overhead costs, and making us feel that every meal we ate was bought with her blood and sweat. The papers resting on my lap in that dusty study completely obliterated that narrative. The certified land survey proved that Ruth Ellery did not just own the small footprint of the cafe, she owned the massive, undeveloped dirt lot directly behind it, stretching all the way to the main commercial avenue. More importantly, attached to the deed was a legally binding buyout option with a major commercial developer. If the neighborhood was ever zoned for a commercial redevelopment project, that combined plot of land was not worth a modest sum. It was worth a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. My grandmother was not a struggling diner owner. She was a patient, calculating real estate holdout sitting on a gold mine. But the true shock, the revelation that forced all the air from my lungs and left me dizzy on the hardwood floor, was buried on the 3rd page of the trust appendix. The document outlined the succession of the estate. The sole voting beneficiary, the only person granted the legal authority to sell, leverage, or alter the property after Ruth passed away, was not her only daughter, Colleen. It was me. My grandmother had quietly bypassed her own child. Establishing an ironclad protective trust structure, the legal jargon was dense, but the intent was as clear as a ringing bell. Ruth knew exactly who Colleen was. She knew my mother was a financial black hole. The trust was specifically designed to prevent the cafe and the land from ever being used as collateral to cover the endless spiraling debts my mother and brother constantly generated. I sat in the quiet study, the edges of the heavy paper digging into my palms, and realized the monumental scale of the lie. For over half a year, Colleen had deliberately buried this appendix. She had stepped seamlessly into the role of the sole proprietor, running the cafe as her own personal fiefdom. But she had a massive problem. To access the real money, to take out loans against the business, she needed the signature of the actual beneficiary. She needed my authorization. As a vendor risk investigator, I track forged documents for a living. The irony tasted like ash in my mouth. I pulled up my own credit reports and public business filings right there on my phone. It took me less than 45 minutes to find the digital footprints of my mother's desperation. There were 3 massive commercial loans taken out over the past 4 years, all filed under the guise of emergency plumbing renovations and structural roof repairs for the café. Repairs that, suspiciously, never actually happened. I scrolled down to the authorization pages of those digital contracts. Staring back at me was my own electronic signature. It was perfectly replicated, applied to digital documents I had never been shown, attached to IP addresses traced right back to my mother's home office. Initially, my mind violently rejected the evidence. I am trained to be skeptical, but this was my own flesh and blood. I spent 3 agonizing days trying to convince myself that I was misreading the legal context, that perhaps I had signed a blanket authorization years ago and simply forgotten, or that this was some bizarre clerical error by the bank. But numbers do not possess the capacity to lie. As I cross-referenced the dates of the loans with my own emails and work schedules, the cold, undeniable truth crystallized. There was no misunderstanding. This was a systematic, multi-year campaign of identity theft and financial fraud orchestrated by the woman who gave birth to me. Suddenly, 1,000 tiny, insignificant memories from my past mutated, taking on a sinister, venomous meaning. I remembered how aggressively my mother insisted on handling my personal tax returns well into my late 20s. "Let me keep these tax documents in my safe, Brinley," she would say, her tone dripping with false maternal care. "It is just for safety. You are so busy with your corporate job. You do not need to worry about this boring paperwork." She was not protecting my documents. She was securing her access to my social security number and financial identity. I thought about Mason, my perpetually unemployed brother, whose massive gambling debts and luxury car loans magically vanished into thin air every few years. Those bailouts were funded by loans taken out against my name, secured by the property that rightfully belonged to me, and I remembered the fights. Whenever I asked for a small raise during the years I worked double shifts at the café to pay for my college tuition, or whenever I inquired about the family's overall financial health, Colleen would instantly weaponize her tears. "You are always so incredibly selfish, Brinley," she would snap, her face twisting in theatrical disappointment. "We are barely surviving. I am sacrificing everything to keep a roof over our heads, and all you care about is money." The psychological manipulation was so profound, so deeply ingrained, that I had spent my entire adult life believing I was the greedy, ungrateful daughter of a hardworking martyr. The truth was that I was the unwitting bankroll for a family of parasites. I did not confront her. I did not storm into the cafe waving the stolen trust appendix and demanding an explanation. If my career had taught me anything, it was that you never confront a cornered fraudster until you have locked every single exit. From that day in the study onward, I lived 2 completely separate lives. On the surface, I remained the dutiful, slightly distant daughter, but in the shadows, I became the lead investigator on the most important case of my life. I spent the next 6 months quietly building an impenetrable fortress. I secretly copied every single financial record, tax return, and forged signature. I rented a secure server to back up the data. Most importantly, I hired Vera Sloan. I specifically sought out a vicious, high-powered corporate litigation attorney located 3 towns over. Someone completely outside the incestuous social circle of my family and their corrupt real estate friends. We mapped out every hidden asset, traced every stolen dollar, and prepared a legal guillotine. I learned to control my breathing when my mother hugged me. I learned to smile pleasantly when Mason bragged about his new expensive watch. Knowing exactly whose credit score had paid for it, I simply waited. I knew Colleen was getting reckless, desperate to finalize a massive land sale with her new partner, Deacon, before the loans defaulted. I knew she would eventually need me all in one place to force a final, sweeping signature to legitimize her theft. Tonight's elaborate, suffocating birthday dinner was never a surprise party. It was an ambush. But they had tragically miscalculated. They thought they were luring a naive, compliant daughter into a trap. They did not realize they had invited the one person who had finally come prepared, and the mask they had worn for decades had just slipped at exactly the wrong moment. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I did not drive to my mother's house. The temptation to scream, to demand answers, to throw the wreckage of my apartment in her face was a phantom limb I had already amputated. Anger is a remarkably inefficient weapon in a financial war. Precision is what kills. Instead of a confrontation, I walked into the polished marble lobby of my primary bank. I skipped the regular teller queue and took a seat across from a senior fraud specialist. For 45 minutes, I methodically unraveled the structure of my own financial life. I placed a hard freeze on my credit profile across all 3 major reporting bureaus. I revoked every single third-party authorization and completely disabled the old electronic verification systems linked to my Social Security number. Finally, I placed a severe fraud alert on any account, past or present, that bore my name. The specialist looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and quiet alarm, but I just signed the final paperwork with a steady hand. I was locking the doors of the bank vault from the inside. My next stop was the austere glass-walled office of Vera Sloan. Vera was a corporate litigation attorney who possessed the warmth of a surgical scalpel. She had built her terrifying reputation on the simple fact that she absolutely did not care about family dynamics. To Vera, blood was just another fluid. She only cared about ink on paper. I sat across her wide mahogany desk and slid a thick manila folder across the smooth surface. I did not offer any tearful preamble. Here is the police scene report from last night, the digital access logs for my building, the high-resolution photographs of the forced entry, and the certified copy of the trust appendix they were trying to steal, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any tremor. Vera opened the folder, her sharp eyes scanning the police report first, then the trust document. She did not offer sympathy. She offered strategy. This is incredibly reckless work on their part, Vera noted, her tone dry and analytical. They are operating on pure panic. The trust appendix is ironclad. Brinley, your grandmother drafted this specifically to bypass probate courts. I am drafting an emergency injunction right now. A lis pendens, I confirmed. Exactly, Vera replied, her fingers already flying across her sleek keyboard. A formal notice of pending litigation. By noon today, I will have it filed with the county clerk. It will place an absolute legal freeze on the Juniper Glass Café property and the entire undeveloped lot behind it. Any attempt to sell the land, secure a new mortgage, or transfer the deed will be instantly blocked until this dispute is resolved in a courtroom. If your mother and her new fiancé are trying to close a quiet commercial buyout, we are about to throw a massive wrench directly into their engine. Do it, I said, standing up to leave. Lock it all down. By 10 o'clock, I was sitting at my usual desk at Harbor Slate Compliance Group. The low hum of the corporate office was a comforting white noise. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and logged into my dual-monitor workstation. I did not breathe a single word to my colleagues about the police tape currently decorating my front door. I simply opened my proprietary cash flow analysis software and treated my family like any other corrupt corporate entity I was hired to dismantle. I fed the downloaded bank statements from the Café into the parsing program. Within 20 minutes, the sterile algorithms began to reveal a beautifully ugly pattern. The Café was supposedly struggling to make payroll, yet the cash flow model showed massive, consistent bleeds. Every month, thousands of dollars were quietly routed from the primary business operating account into a phantom corporate entity registered as Red Clay Facilities. I dug into the public registration for Red Clay. It was a classic shell company, a hollow vessel designed solely to launder money. From Red Clay, the funds fractured into dozens of smaller, harder-to-track microtransactions. I followed the digital breadcrumbs directly to their final destinations. The Café's supposed operating budget was paying off high-interest credit cards, funding luxury car rentals, financing weekend vacations to coastal resorts, and settling massive, recurring gambling debts belonging entirely to Mason. My brother was literally eating the walls of the family business, and my mother was handing him the silver spoon. But Mason was just a greedy amateur. The real professional was sitting at the head of the birthday table. I ran a secondary search on the Café's outgoing ledger and found a separate series of aggressive payments categorized as site development consulting fees. These payments, some as high as $25,000 apiece, were being funneled directly to a firm called Vale Urban Strategy. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the screen. Deacon Vale. My mother's new, supposedly wealthy fiancé was not an innocent bystander or a white knight swooping in to save a failing family business. He was deeply, parasitically embedded in the financial architecture of the scam. He was bleeding the property dry through bogus consulting invoices while simultaneously setting himself up to acquire the land. Then, I found the climax of their arrogance. Digging through the archived commercial loan applications, I finally isolated the 3 massive debt files that had kept the café afloat over the last 4 years. I pulled up the final authorization pages. There it was, my own electronic signature, supposedly guaranteeing hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. But as an investigator, I know that digital signatures carry metadata, and visual anomalies are often the first sign of a crude forgery. I magnified the PDF files by 400%. The signature was completely wrong. It was my name, yes, but the digital ink strokes were heavily pixelated, unnaturally stretched, and completely lacked the fluid, biometric pressure points of my actual handwriting. They had not simply forged my name. They had taken a low-resolution scan of an old signature from a forgotten tax document, digitally warped it to fit the new forms, and stamped it onto binding legal contracts. They had not merely stolen from me, they had actively, systematically constructed a framework to make me the sole guarantor of their massive, fraudulent debt. If the café went bankrupt, if the land sale fell through, Colleen and Deacon would walk away clean. The banks would come directly for me, and I would have been completely blindsided. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my cell phone sitting on the edge of my desk lit up. It was Colleen. I let it ring. A minute later, it lit up again, then a third time, then a fourth. I picked up the device and watched the screen. A voicemail notification appeared, then another. I opened the transcription application. The first message was a frantic, breathless demand to call her back immediately. The second message shifted into a tearful, begging plea, asking if I was mad at her, swearing she only wanted what was best for our family. The third message, left only 5 minutes later, abandoned the maternal facade entirely. It was a vicious, screaming tirade, cursing my name and demanding to know what I had done to the bank accounts. The credit freezes had just hit their system. The automated fraud alerts had locked them out of the forged accounts, and Vera's legal injunction had likely just flagged their pending real estate transaction. The oxygen had officially been cut off. I sat in the quiet, air-conditioned calm of my office, listening to my mother lose her mind through a digital recording. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. The first cut had been made, clean and deep, and as the phone continued to violently vibrate on my desk, I knew they were finally beginning to suffocate. The next 48 hours blurred into a relentless, caffeinated deep dive through municipal zoning databases and encrypted corporate registries. While my mother was busy burning up my phone battery with a barrage of increasingly unhinged voicemails, I was dissecting the actual mechanics of her greed. I had initially assumed this was a simple case of a desperate woman bleeding a small family business to fund a miserable lifestyle. But as I pulled the internal city planning records from the county server, the true, terrifying scale of the operation materialized on my dual monitors. Juniper Glass Café was not just a failing diner sitting on a busy corner. It was the geographical linchpin of a massive, impending commercial redevelopment initiative. The internal documents, heavily redacted but readable to a trained compliance investigator, referred to the project as the Riverton Exchange Corridor. A consortium of out-of-state private equity firms had spent the last 2 years quietly lobbying the city council to rezone our entire historic district. They wanted to bulldoze the old brick warehouses, the independent storefronts, and the family-owned lots to construct a sprawling, high-density luxury retail and residential complex. And right in the dead center of their proposed architectural footprint sat my grandmother's property. The cafe and the massive, undeveloped dirt lot directly behind it constituted the largest single parcel of land required for the developers to break ground. The financial projections attached to the zoning proposal were staggering. The developers were not offering standard market value. They were offering aggressive, desperate buyout premiums. If a unified ownership block could consolidate the title and hand over a clean deed before the end of the third fiscal quarter, the payout would be astronomical. The land was not worth a few $100,000. It was valued at tens of millions of dollars. The café was merely a fragile, peeling coat of paint covering a solid gold brick. Suddenly, the suffocating theatricality of my 34th birthday dinner made perfect, chilling sense. The sudden, overwhelming desire to mend fences, the expensive floral arrangements, the bizarre speech about absolute family trust. None of it was driven by a sudden burst of maternal affection. It was a calculated, desperate sprint against a corporate deadline. Colleen and her fiancé, Deacon Vale, needed to finalize the preliminary consolidation paperwork by the end of the week to lock in the developer's premium buyout rate. They did not need a daughter. They simply needed a living, breathing hand to hold a pen and sign away a fortune disguised as a stack of routine family tax forms. But the deeper I dug into the draft acquisition agreements buried in Deacon's corporate filings, the darker the reality became. I uncovered a preliminary term sheet tucked away in a subfolder labeled for legal compliance. As I read through the dense, heavily lawyered paragraphs outlining the transfer of liability, a cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. In a standard commercial real estate transaction, the sellers must provide legal warranties guaranteeing that the property is free of hidden debts, fraudulent liens, or contested ownership. If those warranties are breached, the buyers can sue the guarantors for massive financial damages, and federal prosecutors can step in to file criminal fraud charges. I scrolled down to the signature block of the liability warranty page. The name printed under the primary guarantor line was not Colleen Perry. It was not Deacon Vale. It was Brinley Perry. My breath hitched in my throat. They were not just trying to steal my inheritance. They were actively constructing a legal firewall made entirely out of my flesh and blood. Colleen knew she had been running a fraudulent ledger for years. She knew she had forged my electronic signature to secure illegal loans. If the developers bought the land and subsequently discovered the massive web of financial crimes attached to the title, the resulting legal explosion would be catastrophic. By naming me as the sole legal guarantor of the property's clean history, my mother and her partner had designed a flawless escape hatch. They would take the tens of millions of dollars from the sale and vanish, leaving me holding the smoking gun. When the federal investigators inevitably came knocking to ask about the forged signatures and the laundered money, the paper trail would point entirely to the registered beneficiary who had just warranted the sale. They were going to feed me to the wolves to ensure their own clean getaway. It was a level of sociopathic planning that genuinely took my breath away. But as I sat in the sterile glow of my office monitors, the brilliance of my grandmother's protective trust suddenly shone through the darkness like a lighthouse. Ruth Ellery had known exactly what her daughter was capable of. She had anticipated this exact scenario. That was why she had instructed her attorney to weave a multi-layered poison pill directly into the trust's foundational DNA. I pulled up the certified copy I had rescued from the blue tin and reread the specific penalty clause. The legal language was absolute. Any attempt by the secondary manager, which was Colleen, to leverage, mortgage, or transfer the primary asset without the explicit, notarized, and in-person consent of the primary beneficiary would trigger an immediate, automatic suspension of all management rights. My grandmother had built a trap door right beneath my mother's feet. If Colleen tried to sell the property out from under me, the trust would legally amputate her authority the second the ink dried. But Colleen, blinded by her own greed and Deacon's smooth promises, had completely ignored the fine print. She assumed the trust was just a standard piece of paper that could be easily circumvented or destroyed. She truly believed that if Mason could just break into my apartment, smash open the wall, and incinerate the blue tin containing the original documents, the rules would simply cease to exist. She thought she could rewrite reality by burning the evidence. completely unaware that I had already memorized the playbook and removed the ball from the field. I leaned back in my chair, staring blindly out the large window of my corporate office at the sprawling city skyline. The heavy rain from the previous night had finally stopped, leaving the streets below looking washed and sharply defined. The parameters of my mission had fundamentally shifted. When I first discovered the hidden appendix 6 months ago, my goal had been quietly defensive. I just wanted to protect my own credit score, untangle myself from their toxic debt, and perhaps force them to acknowledge the truth. I wanted personal justice for a lifetime of emotional manipulation. That was no longer enough. This was no longer just a bitter family squabble over a dusty diner and a few forged checks. I was standing in the direct path of a massive, illegal corporate takeover, wrapped in the deceptive, comforting camouflage of a family business. My mother and her associates were perfectly willing to destroy my entire life, strip me of my freedom, and leave me facing federal prison time just to secure a real estate payout. I closed the final window on my monitor and locked my workstation. The anger I had been suppressing for days finally crystallized into something cold, hard, and incredibly focused. I was not going to just block the sale. I was going to let them build their fraudulent house of cards right to the very top. I was going to let them invite the developers, the bankers, and the investors to the table. And then, when they were absolutely certain they had won, I was going to bring the entire scheme down around them. The digital trail bleeding from Vale Urban Strategy was a complex labyrinth of mirrored servers, offshore holding accounts, and heavily encrypted folders. However, sheer arrogance always leaves a back door unlocked. Deacon Vale genuinely believed he was the smartest predator operating in the city, which meant he was lazy enough to reuse his administrative passwords across his shadow accounts. By 2 o'clock in the morning, I had gained access to a backup of his private communications. What I found waiting inside the digital vault was not just a roadmap of my mother's impending destruction, but a breathtaking masterpiece of double betrayal. Deacon was not building a shared financial empire with Colleen. He was meticulously measuring her for a coffin, buried deep in a subfolder cynically labeled for post-acquisition restructuring. I discovered a complete set of parallel draft contracts. These were the cleanup documents, heavily vetted by expensive corporate lawyers, designed to be executed the absolute second the commercial developers wired the massive buyout funds. According to this alternate legal reality, Deacon was officially stepping in as a valiant, independent third-party investor who had graciously arrived to save a distressed local property. The paperwork cleanly and legally severed his new holding company from the Café's incredibly toxic history. The genius of his cruelty was in the liability clauses. All the crippling federal tax liabilities, the defaulted high-interest bridge loans, and the severe criminal penalties for the fraudulent income declarations were explicitly funneled into a newly formed corporate shell. And the sole managing director, the only individual legally responsible for that doomed, debt-ridden shell company, was Colleen Perry. Even in a grand conspiracy specifically designed to rob me of my inheritance, my own mother was nothing more than a temporary accomplice. She was a human shield being polished and prepared for the ultimate sacrifice. If the federal authorities ever launched a post-sale audit to investigate the forged signatures and missing funds, Deacon would simply walk away into the sunset with tens of millions of dollars in clean developer cash. Colleen would be left standing alone in the blast zone, holding the smoking gun for every single forged check and fake invoice. But the rot inside my family tree went even deeper than Deacon's greed. As I cross-referenced the email timestamps, I noticed a series of encrypted messages sent from an anonymous, untraceable account directly to Deacon's primary inbox. I ran a quick syntax analysis on the text, searching for familiar speech patterns. The desperate, misspelled pleading, the aggressive shifts between begging and demanding, the absolute lack of basic punctuation. The digital fingerprint was unmistakable. It was Mason, my brother, currently drowning in massive gambling debts owed to a violent syndicate of shadow lenders who did not bother using formal collection agencies, had successfully secured his own private life raft. Attached to Mason's emails were dozens of high-resolution, scanned images of my mother's private, handwritten accounting ledgers. He had waited until she left the house, sneaked into her locked home office, systematically photographed her entire fraudulent bookkeeping system, and sold her out directly to Deacon. In exchange for handing over the ultimate, irrefutable blackmail material on his own mother, Deacon had promised to secretly wire enough funds to wipe Mason's underworld slate clean. Furthermore, Deacon offered him a completely meaningless but highly compensated executive title in the new property management firm once the dust settled. Mason traded his mother's freedom for cleared debts and a fake corner office. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, bathed in the harsh blue light of my monitors, and a bitter, hollow laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the empty office. There was absolutely no loyalty inside the Perry household. I finally realized that this family structure did not operate on maternal love, shared history, or even basic criminal solidarity. It operated entirely on a state of perpetual, panicked bargaining. Every single person sitting around that expensive birthday table was merely playing a temporary role, waiting with bated breath for the precise moment to slip a cold knife between the ribs of the person sitting right next to them. Mason was betraying Colleen to save his own life. Deacon was betraying Colleen to hoard the massive real estate payout. Colleen was betraying me to fund the pathetic illusion that she was still in control of a failing dynasty. The primal instinct to scream, to forward the damning emails directly to my mother's phone and watch their entire toxic alliance implode overnight in a fiery wreckage, flared hot and bright in my chest. But I immediately, forcefully suppressed it. A loud, messy confrontation would only scatter the cockroaches back into the dark crevices of the wall. The most effective way to permanently destroy a poisonous ecosystem is not to yell at it. It is to let the parasites continue to feed on each other, absolutely convinced that their individual, treacherous secrets are perfectly safe until the exact, devastating moment of truth. I would let them march happily toward the edge of the cliff, holding hands in the dark, confident in their individual victories. My secure office phone rang sharply at 9 o'clock the following morning. It was Vera Sloan. Her tone was brisk, completely lacking any standard morning pleasantries, which usually meant she had found something incredibly lethal. "I tracked down Nadine Crowell," Vera announced over the secure line, the faint sound of a car engine humming in the background. "She was the senior notary public who handled your grandmother's estate planning before she retired and moved out to the quiet suburbs. I am sitting in my car outside her house right now." I sat up completely straight, grabbing a heavy brass pen from my desk. "Did she have anything useful for us?" "She had an insurance policy," Vera replied smoothly. Nadine confirmed she was given very explicit, binding instructions regarding the trust structure. Your grandmother handed her a sealed package many years ago. She was sworn under a strict non-disclosure agreement to hold on to it and only deliver it directly into your hands under one single, specific condition. "And what was that condition?" I asked, my grip tightening on the cool metal of the pen. "If Colleen ever tried to turn the family cafe into her personal cash machine," Vera recited flawlessly. Those were Ruth Ellery's exact words. Nadine read the legal injunction I filed with the county clerk yesterday morning. She saw the total freeze on the commercial property and knew the condition had finally been met. She handed it over without a fight. "I have the package sitting right here on my passenger seat." I met Vera exactly 1 hour later in a sterile, brightly lit, glass-walled conference room at her downtown law firm. The package was a heavy, aged manila envelope sealed with brittle, yellowing tape. I sliced it open with a sharp silver letter opener. Inside rested a single, handwritten letter on thick, cream-colored stationery and a small, black digital memory drive. The letter was written in my grandmother's elegant, sloping, old-fashioned cursive. It was not a warm, sentimental goodbye from a loving matriarch. It was a precise, tactical briefing written by a woman who knew with absolute certainty that her own daughter was a parasite wearing a mother's face. The letter provided exact instructions on how to access the video file contained on the drive, warning me that what I was about to watch would alter my understanding of my family forever. For exactly 48 hours, I let my mother scream into the digital void. I watched the missed calls pile up on my screen like casualties on a battlefield. I listened to the voicemails transition seamlessly from hyperventilating panic to sheer, unadulterated venom, and I did absolutely nothing. Silence is a flawless mirror, and I wanted Colleen to stare at her own ugly reflection until the glass finally cracked. The hardest lesson I had learned in corporate compliance was that fraudsters always defeated themselves if you just gave them enough quiet room to panic. On the morning of the third day, as the sun barely crested over the city skyline, I finally picked up my phone and drafted a single, meticulously calculated text message. "I am willing to sit down like adults," I typed, forcing my fingers to remain perfectly steady over the glass screen. If we can resolve everything in a civilized and completely private manner, it was the exact, weaponized phrasing Colleen had utilized her entire life to sweep decades of emotional abuse and financial ruin under the family rug. It was her absolute favorite bait, and I watched her swallow it whole. Less than 2 minutes later, my screen illuminated brightly with her immediate reply. The aggressive, threatening tone she had used to terrorize me for the past 2 days vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by the cloying, suffocating warmth of a deeply concerned mother merely looking out for her flock. "Oh, my sweet girl," she wrote, the digital words practically dripping with manufactured sympathy. "I knew this was just a terrible misunderstanding. You have been under so much extreme work stress lately. Your mind is just playing tricks on you. Let us clear the air once and for all. We can do a small, intimate gathering with the lawyers, our accountant, and the new investors just to clarify the paperwork." She genuinely thought she was cornering me. By formally inviting the legal professionals and the wealthy investors, she was deliberately planning to leverage heavy social pressure to force my signature. She wanted an audience to watch me yield. I typed my response, carefully orchestrating the invisible trap closing around her ankles. I agreed to the meeting, but I firmly insisted on holding it at Juniper Glass Café this coming Sunday afternoon. I reasoned with her that it was neutral family ground, guaranteed to be quiet and empty on a Sunday weekend closure, and private enough for a highly sensitive financial discussion. Colleen eagerly agreed, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just selected the precise site of her impending execution. She believed she possessed the ultimate home field advantage by hosting the ambush in her own territory. She did not realize I was quietly locking the heavy wooden doors from the outside. While Colleen spent the remainder of the week frantically planning what she confidently believed would be a triumphant, tearful reconciliation and a lucrative contract signing, I was operating a shadow war room from behind Vera Sloane's massive mahogany desk. We moved with cold, clinical precision. We legally solidified the absolute freeze on the property records, ensuring that absolutely nothing could be transferred, sold, or leveraged. I drafted heavily worded, legally binding evidence preservation letters and sent them via certified mail to every single commercial bank holding an account remotely linked to the cafe or my mother's name. But I knew I needed physical, undeniable leverage from inside the building itself. I bypassed the vulnerable cloud servers entirely and remotely accessed the cafe's outdated, hardwired security camera network from my corporate laptop. I spent 6 agonizing hours quietly downloading 3 years of archived video footage, securing the massive files onto an encrypted external hard drive. Then, I stepped away from the screens and tracked down the human element of my mother's destruction. Tessa Boone and Eli Mercer had worked the front retail counter and the greasy back kitchen of Juniper Glass Café since I was an awkward teenager in middle school. I met them late Thursday evening in a dimly lit, smoky diner on the far industrial side of town, sliding 2 thick manila envelopes across the sticky laminate table. The envelopes contained ironclad non-disclosure agreements and generous cash retainers to cover their inevitable lost wages. They did not hesitate for a single second. In hushed, nervous voices, constantly looking over their shoulders, they provided sworn, legally recorded statements detailing exactly what they witnessed on the night my grandmother died in the hospital. They clearly testified that a full 2 hours before the hospital ward even called to officially announce Ruth's passing, Colleen was already barricaded in the back office. They watched through the cracked door as she frantically loaded thick stacks of financial ledgers, banking statements, and tax documents into a heavy canvas duffel bag before shoving them deep into the floor safe. She was hiding the bodies before the heart had even stopped beating. Legally speaking, I was now heavily armed and incredibly dangerous. Vera had successfully petitioned a local county judge for a temporary civil order. The document officially recognized a formal legal dispute over the management and control of the family trust, but I explicitly instructed Vera not to serve the order or make it public in any database. It remained a loaded weapon hidden squarely in my coat pocket. I needed Colleen, Deacon, and Mason to confidently walk into that cafe on Sunday afternoon, absolutely convinced that my forged signature was the only tiny hurdle standing between them and tens of millions of dollars. The final, devastating piece of the arsenal came directly from Nadine Crowell. The retired notary public had securely mailed a small, heavy brass key to Vera's downtown office. It belonged to an anonymous, climate-controlled storage unit located in a desolate concrete complex on the edge of the city limits. I drove there completely alone under the cover of heavy darkness. Inside the dusty, corrugated metal unit sat a single, heavy-duty fireproof lockbox. I inserted the brass key and turned it, the heavy metal mechanism clacking loudly like a gunshot in the empty concrete hallway. Inside the protective box lay the original master copies of the video recordings my grandmother had made, but far more importantly, it held a thick, worn, leather-bound notebook. I sat on the cold concrete floor and flipped through the brittle, yellowing pages under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent bulb of the storage facility. The notebook was a secret, meticulously detailed diary of systematic family theft. In her sharp, elegant, unwavering handwriting, Ruth had documented every single time Colleen had shamelessly begged for a hot cash loan to cover a fabricated personal disaster. Next to every single monetary entry was the elaborate lie Colleen had used to justify pulling the cash directly from the business register. My mother had aggressively claimed she needed $10,000 for emergency commercial plumbing repairs. The notebook explicitly revealed the money went straight to Mason's violent underground bookie. She had cited $15,000 for a brand new commercial kitchen exhaust hood. The corresponding banknotes proved the money paid off her own luxury car lease. Sitting entirely alone in that freezing storage unit, a new, profoundly deep layer of grief washed over my shoulders, feeling infinitely heavier than any of the burning anger I had experienced so far. My grandmother was not a foolish, blind, or naive old woman who had been easily swindled by her highly manipulative daughter. She knew exactly who Colleen Perry was. She knew every single lie, every stolen dollar, and every fabricated, tearful emergency. Ruth had silently, stoically, endured the relentless parasitic draining of her own life's work for decades. She had voluntarily absorbed the massive financial blows, swallowing the toxic poison daily, just to keep the cafe's doors open long enough for me to reach functional adulthood. She had fiercely preserved the core asset until it could be safely and legally passed into the hands of the one person capable of ending the vicious cycle of generational theft. I slowly closed the leather notebook, the soft thud of the cover echoing with absolute finality. The hardest part of this entire operation was no longer gathering the forensic evidence. The evidence was overwhelming, stacked so incredibly high it threatened to block out the sun entirely. The most agonizing, physically painful challenge was the waiting. It was the crushing, agonizing restraint required to keep my facial expressions completely blank, to keep my vocal tone perfectly steady, and to not show my winning hand a single second too early. I knew with cold certainty that if I wanted to truly win, if I wanted to permanently sever the rot from the root and save my own life, I could not just push them off the ledge in a fit of rage. I had to smile warmly, hold the door wide open, and politely invite them to walk to the absolute edge of the cliff all by themselves. Sunday was rapidly approaching. The stage was perfectly set, and I was entirely prepared to sit quietly and watch them fall. Sitting with Tessa Boone and Eli Mercer in that smoky diner had yielded more than just cold legal leverage. It had provided the missing emotional context to my mother's decades of systemic abuse. They were not just employees. For over 10 years, they had been the bruised, exhausted backbone of Juniper Glass Café. As they sipped their lukewarm black coffee, the true extent of Colleen's daily cruelty spilled out, painted in the mundane horrors of wage theft and emotional manipulation. Colleen had weaponized the concept of family against the very people who actually kept the grills burning and the tables clean. "We are all making massive sacrifices to keep this family business alive," she used to tell them, using that exact phrase to justify delaying their meager paychecks by 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Eli, whose hands were permanently scarred from years working the old deep fryer, explained in a quiet, defeated voice how she regularly skimmed their cash tips, claiming it was a mandatory contribution to a phantom maintenance fund. She even forced them to sign physical receipts for holiday bonus payments that completely did not exist, threatening to fire them immediately and ruin their local references if they refused to comply. They signed because they were desperate, and she preyed on that desperation with the casual ease of a seasoned predator. But it was Tessa who delivered the memory that completely shattered my remaining, carefully maintained composure. Her eyes welled with tears as she recalled the chaotic, terrifying night the ambulance came for my grandmother. Tessa had ridden in the back of the glaring, flashing vehicle, holding Ruth's fragile, shaking hand until I could sprint through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. "She was fading so fast. Brinley," Tessa whispered across the sticky laminate table, her voice trembling with the heavy weight of the memory. "But when you finally ran into that sterile hospital room, she pulled you down close to her face. I was standing right there by the heart monitor. I heard exactly what she said to you." The memory, deeply buried beneath layers of intense grief and my mother's subsequent gaslighting, suddenly surged to the forefront of my mind with absolute, crystal clarity. I remembered the harsh, stinging smell of antiseptic and the frantic, rhythmic beeping of the medical machines. I remembered Ruth gripping my wrist with a desperate, final surge of physical strength. "Do not let people sell our memories like old tables and chairs," Ruth had whispered, her breath rattling painfully in her chest. At the time, I thought it was just the feverish, disjointed rambling of a dying woman terrified of losing her physical home. Now, sitting in the devastating aftermath of my mother's orchestrated break-in and the impending corporate buyout, that single sentence echoed in my mind not as a frightened plea, but as a direct, undeniable command. That command was fully realized the next morning when I finally watched the remainder of the grainy video file recovered from the hidden storage unit. Sitting in Vera Sloane's pristine, glass-walled conference room, I watched my grandmother speak from beyond the grave. Her voice was incredibly weak, but her resolve was forged from pure steel. Ruth stared directly into the camera lens, addressing me with a raw, uncompromising honesty that we had rarely shared during her life. She meticulously explained the exact reasoning behind the secret trust structure. "I am not giving you the controlling authority because I love your mother any less, Brinley," Ruth stated, her dark eyes piercing through the digital noise. "I am giving it to you because you are the absolute only person in this entire bloodline who does not look at Juniper Glass Café and see a bottomless well of cash to feed your own selfishness. You are the only one who ever actually respected the work." Then, she laid down the ultimate moral condition of my inheritance. Ruth explicitly stipulated that if the property was successfully defended and legally secured under my name, it could not simply be sold for a massive, immediate personal profit. A legally mandated 25% of all future operational profits, or the proceeds of any legitimate future sale, had to be permanently diverted into an apprenticeship fund dedicated to supporting local, underprivileged restaurant workers. Furthermore, she demanded that priority hiring and proper, backdated financial compensation must be explicitly offered to the original, loyal staff, specifically, Tessa and Eli. I paused the video, staring at the frozen image of my grandmother's weathered face. The profound weight of her grand design settled heavily onto my shoulders. This was never just about stopping a greedy land grab or extracting personal revenge on Colleen for a lifetime of psychological torment. Ruth had orchestrated a brilliant, ironclad mechanism of total restitution. I was not just fighting to take my own power back. I was legally and morally obligated to restore the dignity and the financial security that my mother had ruthlessly gutted from the people who actually deserved it. My phone buzzed loudly, breaking the heavy silence of the room. Vera walked in, holding a thick file folder, a rare, genuine smile playing on her sharp features. "I just got off a highly secure call with an old colleague of mine," Vera announced, dropping the heavy file onto the polished mahogany table. "He is a senior director at the Financial Integrity Task Group. It is a highly specialized, multi-agency financial crimes unit." I raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Are federal investigators truly interested in a small family diner?" "They are not interested in the diner," Vera corrected smoothly, taking a seat across from me. "They are highly interested in the Riverton Exchange Corridor project. They have been quietly tracking a massive pattern of small business fraud and illegal property coercion tied directly to the commercial developers Deacon Vale is currently working with. Your mother's forged loan documents and Deacon's shadow contracts are the exact missing puzzle pieces they desperately need to blow a massive regional racketeering case wide open." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening against my neck. "So they are going to arrest them before the meeting?" "Not yet," Vera cautioned, holding up a single, perfectly manicured finger. "A paper trail is excellent, but aggressive corporate defense lawyers can drag paper crimes out in court for 5 to 10 years, blaming clerical errors, faulty software, or dead accountants. To move swiftly, to lock them up and freeze the developers' massive assets immediately. The task group needs something completely undeniable. They need to witness a live, intentional act of fraud. They need to see the physical coercion happen in real time. The final, decisive piece of the chessboard slammed violently into place. The upcoming Sunday brunch was no longer just a clever trap to serve unexpected legal papers. It had to be a meticulously controlled, incredibly high-stakes theatrical performance. I needed to walk into the cafe and actively play the exact role they expected: the exhausted, overwhelmed, defeated daughter. I had to push Colleen, Mason, and Deacon to the absolute brink, forcing them to explicitly state their malicious intentions to coerce my signature, actively lie about the source of the property funds, and attempt to finalize the fraudulent transfer in front of a room full of attentive people. "We need witnesses in that room who actually understand exactly what they are watching," I said, my voice hardening into a low, steady cadence. "We cannot just have their corrupt real estate brokers sitting there nodding along. We need our own people embedded directly in the crowd." Vera nodded in complete agreement. "I will be there, sitting quietly at a table in the back. Nadine Crowell has agreed to attend as a supposed neutral party for the final notarization process, and my contact has arranged for 2 undercover agents from the task group to pose as junior paralegals accompanying the development team. They will be wearing recording devices." Everything was finally perfectly aligned. Every single thread of my mother's deceit, every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every single tear she had ever faked for sympathy was about to be pulled incredibly taut at the exact same moment. Juniper Glass Café had been the beating heart of our fractured family for 3 generations. It had silently witnessed every birthday, every strained holiday, and every quiet, insidious betrayal. It was deeply poetically fitting that this worn, familiar space was destined to be the final arena. When I walked through those heavy wooden doors on Sunday afternoon, the building would completely shed its identity as a welcoming family establishment. The dining tables would transform into witness stands, the hidden digital ledgers would serve as the binding evidence, and the air itself would be thick with the terrifying, suffocating gravity of absolute accountability. It was going to become a merciless, unforgiving courtroom, completely devoid of a judge's bench, where the only verdict delivered would be total, irrevocable ruin. The ambient temperature inside Juniper Glass Café on Sunday afternoon felt at least 10 degrees hotter than usual, thick with the competing scents of freshly brewed espresso, heavily catered salmon crostini, and the sharp metallic tang of raw desperation. Colleen had not arranged a private, civilized mediation between family members. She had orchestrated a massive theatrical production, billing the afternoon to her carefully selected guests as a belated birthday redo brunch for her beloved daughter. I stepped through the heavy glass front doors at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The main dining floor was unnervingly crowded for a day the business was supposedly closed. My mother had invited the entire predatory ecosystem of our city, 2 local real estate brokers wearing aggressive smiles and thousands of dollars worth of tailored suits, her complicit personal accountant nervously clutching a crystal highball glass, and the primary investors from the commercial development firm. These investors were accompanied by 2 sharply dressed junior paralegals who I knew for an absolute fact were undercover federal agents from the Financial Integrity Task Group. Colleen's strategic planning was transparently brilliant in its sheer cruelty. By packing the room with wealthy, influential local figures and high-powered executives, she was constructing an invisible, crushing wall of intense social pressure. If I was forced to sign the property transfer documents surrounded by clinking champagne flutes and applauding investors, she could successfully frame the hostile takeover as a beautiful, heartwarming family reunion. To the outside world, and more importantly to the law, it would simply look like a difficult daughter finally coming to her senses and doing the right, generous thing for her struggling mother. I kept my physical posture deliberately slumped. My shoulders curled inward just a fraction of an inch to project the exact image of a woman who had finally run out of fight after days of relentless harassment. I wore a simple, unpressed beige trench coat over a plain black turtleneck, carrying absolutely nothing but a thin, worn leather portfolio under my right arm. I wanted them to look at my face and see a battered, exhausted opponent waving a massive white flag of surrender. Across the dining room, Deacon Vale stood proudly near the head of the arranged conference table. He looked disgustingly triumphant, his left hand resting possessively on a massive, suspiciously complete stack of legal documents bound in dark leather. It takes a normal corporate legal team at least 3 full weeks to draft a comprehensive commercial property transfer of this magnitude. Deacon had miraculously produced a flawless, airtight portfolio of over 200 pages in less than 48 hours, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that these fraudulent contracts had been waiting in the dark for many months. My younger brother, Mason, was completely failing to match Deacon's arrogant, icy composure. He was stationed near the old mahogany bar on the far side of the room, practically vibrating out of his own skin. He held a glass of club soda with a white-knuckled grip, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically from my face to the large analog clock hanging directly above the swinging kitchen doors. I knew exactly what was fueling his silent, paralyzing panic. The aggressive, high-interest bridge loan he had secured from his violent underground lenders, totaling over $50,000, was set to formally default in less than 4 hours. He was sweating right through his expensive designer dress shirt, absolutely terrified that I might read the paperwork too slowly and cost him his life. I walked slowly toward the center table, my flat shoes making almost no sound on the hardwood floor, briefly scanning the perimeter of the room to locate my concealed artillery. Vera Sloan was sitting quietly in a dimly lit corner booth, dressed down in a casual gray cashmere sweater, looking entirely disengaged from the main event. She was playing the role of a silent, passive observer to absolute perfection. Her eyes focused intently on her glowing phone screen, while her sharp mind cataloged every single legal violation happening in the room. Nadine Crowell, the retired notary public, was seated near the front display window, calmly sipping a warm cup of chamomile tea as if she were just another Sunday regular enjoying the quiet atmosphere. And hovering near the back hallway by the employee lockers, completely out of uniform and dressed in nondescript civilian clothes, were Tessa and Eli. They blended perfectly into the manufactured crowd, 2 silent ghosts from the kitchen waiting patiently to watch the corrupt empire burn to the ground. As I finally took my designated seat at the center table, the low, buzzing murmur of background conversation abruptly died down. Colleen stepped forward, her face perfectly composed into a flawless mask of maternal sorrow and overwhelming relief. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it gently against her crystal water glass. A sickening, deliberate repetition of the birthday dinner from just a few agonizing days ago. "Thank you all so much for coming here today," Colleen began, her voice quivering with expertly practiced, tearful emotion. She reached out across the table and placed her warm, perfectly manicured hand over my cold one. I let it sit there, completely limp and unresponsive. Our family has recently navigated some incredibly dark, treacherous waters. We lost our way. We let the immense daily stress of managing this beautiful, historic property drive a terrible wedge between us. But today is about healing. It is about putting the past completely behind us, avoiding any ugly public misunderstandings, and making absolutely sure that Juniper Glass Café remains a shining source of pride for everyone involved. She wiped a single, entirely non-existent tear from the corner of her right eye, seamlessly scanning the crowded room to ensure the wealthy investors were properly absorbing the tragic beauty of her emotional performance. "Brinley has been working under so much extreme corporate pressure," Colleen continued, her tone patronizing, gentle, and incredibly soft, but she finally understands that we are only trying to protect her. We are securing the family legacy so she does not have to carry the massive financial burden all by herself for another single day. It was a masterclass in sociopathic psychological manipulation. She was publicly diagnosing me as mentally incompetent and overwhelmed while simultaneously stealing my multi-million-dollar net worth and doing it all to a round of warm, sympathetic applause from the gathered brokers. As the polite clapping slowly subsided, Deacon immediately moved in for the final, lethal kill. He slid the heavy leather binder across the polished oak table, the thick stack of papers coming to rest directly in front of my chest. He uncapped a heavy gold-plated fountain pen and placed it gently on top of the signature line on the very first page. "It is truly wonderful to have everyone finally on the exact same page," Deacon said, his voice a smooth, oily, rehearsed purr. He tapped the thick document with his right index finger. "Brinley, this is just a standard, routine administrative arrangement. It simply consolidates the management rights under my new holding firm so we can immediately finalize the influx of capital and save the cafe from an ugly foreclosure. The developers are incredibly eager to break ground on the new project, and this little signature just clears up the annoying municipal red tape." I looked down at the documents. I did not need to flip through the pages or read the microscopic fine print because I already knew exactly what was buried deep on page 42. He was completely deliberately ignoring the massive sweeping indemnification clause. He was confidently asking me to sign a legally binding warranty stating that I had personally reviewed and approved every single financial transaction, every forged tax return, and every fraudulent, illegal loan application generated by my mother over the last 4 years. He was smiling warmly while fitting a concrete block firmly around my ankles. The entire room went completely, suffocatingly silent. The only sound in the entire building was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and Mason's ragged, uneven breathing echoing from the bar. The real estate brokers leaned in closer, practically salivating at the thought of their massive, impending commission checks. The undercover agents shifted subtly in their chairs, ensuring their hidden digital recording devices had a perfectly clear audio line to the center table. Vera did not move a single muscle in her dark corner booth. I slowly reached out my right hand and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen. Colleen let out a long, shuddering breath of sheer relief, her tense shoulders dropping a full 2 inches. Deacon's smug, arrogant smile widened even further, his dark eyes already calculating his massive upcoming financial payout. Mason finally took a massive, desperate gulp of his club soda, genuinely believing his kneecaps were officially safe from the violent debt collectors. They all genuinely, deeply thought they had finally won. They thought they had successfully broken me down to my raw component parts and rebuilt me into a compliant, silent, and easily disposable victim. I held the pen suspended exactly 1 inch above the crisp, white signature line. I did not write a single letter of my name. Instead, I slowly raised my head, letting the pathetic mask of the exhausted, defeated daughter completely fall away and shatter on the floor. My physical posture instantly straightened, the manufactured, tired slump vanishing in a fraction of a second. I locked my eyes directly onto Deacon's face, watching the sudden, confusing flicker of terrifying doubt spark behind his arrogant gaze, before shifting my hard stare to meet my mother's suddenly wide, terrified eyes. My voice was not quiet. It was not shaking with fear or sadness. It rang out across the silent dining room, clear, sharp, and perfectly steady, cutting through the thick layer of their manufactured lies like a cold surgical blade. "Before I sign this document," I asked, projecting my words loudly so every single person in the room could hear me perfectly, "are you all absolutely sure you want me to confirm, in front of all these witnesses, that this is the entire truth?" Colleen's face hardened instantly, the warm maternal mask slipping to reveal the rigid, desperate panic underneath. She slammed her hand flat against the heavy oak table. "Stop playing these childish games right now, Brinley," she snapped, her voice dropping its sweet theatricality and taking on a harsh, grating edge. "Do not embarrass us in front of our guests. Just sign the paperwork and let us finalize this." I placed the heavy gold-plated pen back onto the polished wood, pushing it deliberately away from the signature line. I did not look at my mother. Instead, I turned my head toward the back of the room where Eli was standing perfectly still by the kitchen doors. I gave him a single, sharp nod. Eli reached behind the bar and flipped the primary input switch for the massive flat-screen television hanging above the espresso machines. The screen flickered brightly, instantly cutting through the tense atmosphere, and the grainy, high-definition video of Ruth Ellery filled the room. The ambient chatter from the real estate brokers died instantly. My grandmother looked out over the crowded dining room, her voice echoing clearly through the overhead speakers. She systematically, mercilessly, laid out the absolute truth of the estate. She explicitly named me as the sole controlling entity and the only legal voting beneficiary. She detailed the exact parameters of the poison pill clause she had designed. She stated, without any room for legal misinterpretation, that Colleen was explicitly forbidden from mortgaging, leveraging, or transferring the property without my fully voluntary, uncoerced signature. Finally, Ruth looked directly into the camera lens and issued a devastating warning: any attempt to force or manipulate that signature was a direct, criminal violation of the protective trust, resulting in the immediate and permanent termination of all secondary management rights. Before the wealthy investors could even process the legal magnitude of the confession playing on the screen, Vera Sloan materialized from the shadows of her corner booth. She walked briskly to the center table and dropped a heavy, court-stamped document directly on top of Deacon's flawless leather binder. "Lis Pendens," Vera announced, her voice ringing out with terrifying, absolute authority. "A formal civil injunction, as of yesterday morning, this property, and the entire undeveloped commercial lot behind it, is officially frozen by order of the county court. There will be no transfer of ownership today." I reached into my thin portfolio, pulled out a small remote, and aimed it at the television. The video of my grandmother vanished, replaced instantly by a glaringly bright, high-resolution slideshow of forensic financial destruction. I did not yell. I let the data do the screaming for me. I cycled through the massive, blown-up images of the commercial loan applications, pointing out the distorted, digitally warped pixels of my forged signature. I brought up the complex cash flow charts, tracing the stolen thousands directly from the cafe's primary operating account into the phantom shell of red clay facilities. Then, I displayed the fraudulent consulting invoices wired directly to Vale Urban Strategy. For the grand finale, I filled the screen with the stark, brightly lit police photographs of the smashed drywall in my apartment, the empty cavity a glaring testament to their desperate, failed extraction mission. Mason physically broke. A strangled, panicked noise escaped his throat, and he bolted from the bar, sprinting frantically toward the narrow hallway leading to the back office. He was desperate to reach the small, concealed floor safe where he kept his illegal burner phone and the stolen notary stamp he had used for the loan documents. The heavy office door slammed shut behind him. Exactly 10 seconds later, it creaked open again. Mason stumbled back out into the dining room, his face completely ashen, his hands shaking violently as he clutched a thick stack of printed papers. He had opened the safe expecting to find his salvation. Instead, he found the meticulously printed transaction logs, detailing every single illegal payment he had ever made to his underground bookie. I had quietly swapped the contents 3 days ago when I accessed the hardwired security cameras. Deacon Vale, witnessing the absolute, instantaneous vaporization of his multi-million-dollar real estate payout, immediately tried to salvage his own life. He took 3 rapid steps backward, physically distancing himself from Colleen. He threw his hands up in a gesture of manufactured innocence, turning to face the shocked investors. "I am completely appalled," Deacon declared, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. "I am merely a third-party financial advisor. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of these severe internal accounting discrepancies or the forged signatures. Colleen explicitly assured me that the property title was clean and the family was in total agreement." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that sliced right through his pathetic defense. I pressed the button on the remote one final time. The screen shifted to display the highly encrypted, secret emails I had pulled directly from Deacon's private server. Alongside the emails was the parallel, heavily lawyered draft agreement he had planned to execute the second the developer funds cleared. I read the liability clause out loud, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. I highlighted the exact paragraph where Deacon legally funneled every single defaulted bridge loan and every ounce of federal tax liability into a doomed shell company registered exclusively in Colleen's name, ensuring she would face the federal prosecutors alone while he vanished with the clean money. The fragile, toxic alliance detonated. Colleen whipped around, her face twisting in absolute venomous fury, and lunged toward Deacon, screaming that he had manipulated her and set her up to take the fall. Mason, realizing his own mother was going down and taking his only financial lifeline with her, started shouting over both of them. He openly confessed to the entire room that Deacon had explicitly promised to pay off his massive gambling debts in exchange for photographs of Colleen's fraudulent accounting ledgers. Deacon yelled back, his polished corporate facade completely destroyed, calling them both incompetent, desperate liabilities. Within a matter of seconds, the sophisticated business brunch devolved into a chaotic, screaming match of overlapping accusations. They were frantically throwing each other directly under the bus, loudly and publicly confessing to multiple federal felonies in a desperate attempt to save themselves. They were entirely oblivious to the 2 junior paralegals sitting quietly at the adjacent table. The 2 agents from the Financial Integrity Task Group stood up in unison. They reached inside their tailored jackets and produced their federal badges, the gold shields catching the light from the front windows. "Federal agents," the taller one announced, his voice easily cutting through the screaming family. "This building is now an active crime scene. Nobody moves." Simultaneously, the heavy front doors swung open, and 3 uniformed civil enforcement officers marched into the dining room. The lead investigator informed the room that based on the active, recorded coercion, the wire fraud evidence, and the blatant financial perjury, they were immediately sealing all property records, freezing every associated bank account, and seizing all electronic devices present on the premises. The real estate brokers scrambled for the exit, desperate to avoid the blast radius of the federal investigation. Deacon stood frozen, his arrogant jaw completely slack. Mason dropped to his knees, burying his face in his trembling hands. I slowly stood up from the table. The federal handcuffs were not my final, devastating move. I turned to face the remaining investors and the task group agents. "There will be no commercial buyout," I stated, my voice echoing with final, absolute authority. "I am not selling this land to feed a corrupt development project. Once the legal title is officially cleared and restored to my name, I am fundamentally restructuring Juniper Glass Café. I am legally returning the management power and dedicating a permanent share of the future profits directly to the original staff who actually earned it." I looked directly at Tessa and Eli. offering them my first genuine smile of the entire week. Furthermore, I am cutting the Perry name completely and permanently from the control of this operation. Colleen stopped screaming. The federal agents moving toward her with handcuffs did not seem to register in her mind. She stared at me, her eyes wide and hollow. The money was gone. The property was gone. But I could see the exact moment she realized the most devastating loss of all. I had permanently destroyed her stage. She could never, ever spin this story to make herself the tragic, sacrificing victim again. The myth of Colleen Perry was dead. She looked at me as if I were a complete stranger who had just broken into her house. For the first time in my entire life, her cold, hateful stare did not cause a single ounce of pain in my chest. I felt absolutely nothing but a soaring, incredible lightness. The authorities escorted the three of them out through the front doors, the flashing red and blue lights painting the street in rhythmic, violent strokes. The cafe slowly emptied until it was just me, Vera, Tessa, and Eli standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm. I stood perfectly still in the center of the worn hardwood floor, breathing in the scent of roasted espresso beans. My 34th birthday had arrived, but it did not mark the passing of another year. It marked the exact day I finally stopped being a living, breathing asset for a family of parasites, and officially became the undisputed master of my own life. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can interact and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.